Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Houston, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Blue Cypress, which is a family of AI-enabled companies focused on the nonprofit association space. Prior to Blue Cypress, I spent 8 years at Bain & Company, working with large corporations on their emerging tech strategy. So everything from AI to data strategy, whatever else they need to do to move their business forward. And today, I'm very sorry I can't be there with you live, but I want to spend the next half hour or so talking through a decision many of you are making or will be making soon on how you should think about your own data strategy. Is there a significant infrastructure investment required, or can you actually get by with your existing technology given the emergence of AI? So the goal today is to give you a framework for how to think about this decision and make sure you feel equipped to feel comfortable whatever approach you choose. So with that, let me pull up the materials so we can walk through it. Okay, so the conventional wisdom on this has been the same for a while, that when you're thinking of data strategy, you need clean data before you can do analytics. You need to build your data warehouse first, then figure out AI or BI, whatever else you're doing. You need a single source of truth. You need to not skip steps. And all this was largely true up until the last, 3-4 years. But with the emergence of AI, you're now able to do far more with the existing technology and the existing systems you have than you were previously. And given that, there's a question you ask yourself is, are you solving yesterday's problem with tomorrow's budget? What can you do with the new technology today that can read messy data rather than invest a lot of money in a traditional data warehouse? And so the reason this is now possible is what I'm calling the leapfrog moment. So essentially what's happened in the last roughly 24 months, the emergence of the AI's ability to work with messy data. You can now analyze imperfect data or disconnected, coming from multiple sources, that's non-structured, far more effectively than we ever could in the past. You can also now ask questions to your data. So rather than having standard reports that you run or that IT has to build for you, you can ask questions in just plain English, waiting for it to retrieve the answer. The AI is smart enough to look at your data, look at multiple data sources to give you an answer. And this also comes with dramatically lower barriers to entry. So getting a ChatGPT account or a Claude account costs a fraction of what a traditional BI infrastructure would cost. And even if you get your whole team up and running on it, there's often a great deal of savings to often get even more functionality than you might with a traditional system. Using these AI tools is an area, even if you do have a big, large data warehouse investment, you should be exploring and potentially even skipping if you can use these tools to replace what a data warehouse used to do for you. So the analogy I like to use here when I'm thinking about AI is one of telecommunications in developing countries. And so if you look 30, 40 years ago, many developing countries, developing nations, did not have the infrastructure, specifically the landline infrastructure, that enabled more developed countries to handle lots of calls, faxes, whatever the case may be. And they actually were able to skip all those incremental investments and maintenance with the mobile technology that happened in the last several decades. This actually allowed them to leapfrog and get ahead of many developed countries who still had this legacy technology, and then allow them to adopt this pure technology at a lower cost. They jumped over the spend that others did, and even though they were behind for a while, they're now at the front when it comes to mobile technology. And while developed countries have largely made up that ground, it was an area that allowed them to go faster and spending less money. Turning lack of legacy infrastructure into a strength is a very similar analogy to where we are now when it comes to data. That you used to have these big 6-7 figure investments into data warehousing that you just don't need anymore. And then AI can largely get you through without, not entirely, but in many cases can get you through without. And so what this means for you is that rather than the more traditional path of like, okay, we need to get our data right, we analyze it, make sure everything's integrated, make sure the infrastructure's there, long lead time before we can do everything, lots of different steps. The AI approach, you can actually start asking questions right away. Use AI to figure out what needs fixing, where are their data issues? How can we connect multiple data sources to answer our questions? Figuring out what insights do we need, do we get, or can we get before we make this investment? And you start getting these insights almost immediately. You need to be careful and make sure you're using a secure system, so a enterprise version of these tools so that your data is protected. But you can then start asking questions and start building connections with your data to understand what insights are available and see where there might be gaps. Your data as you have is already valuable. And so looking through what you can unlock now before you make this a big investment is often the right choice. Now, I also want to clarify there are still lots of reasons why building more traditional data warehouse makes sense, especially if you have conflict regulatory reporting, where you have lots of compliance, or you need to make sure that you can clearly show the deterministic approach of how you got your data. Then in that case, data warehouse is often a good fit. Related to that, you need to have everything auditable. That the fun and perhaps frustration of AI is that you don't always know what it's thinking. And so not everything it does is auditable. And if that's an issue for you, a traditional data warehouse could be the right option. If you have a huge volume of transactions with strict performance requirements, it's another area where this makes sense. And lastly, you might have a team in place. You might say, hey, I either have a warehouse or I'm most of the way there, or I have lots of capabilities, in which case it could still make sense. It's a large investment, but it does allow you some functionality that AI might not have. And if you already have that investment, you can always use AI on top of it. So this is not to say you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what it is saying is think through what are the requirements your organization faces and making calls like, hey, does this expense or does this investment make sense for us? Now, on the other side, when you can bypass and have this AI first approach, what the beauty of this is allows you to do this exploratory analytics. So let me just figure out what's out there. Let me connect all the data sources I can. Let me dig into it, see what patterns I can see. I can get to it pretty quickly. This doesn't take me weeks. This can take me hours or days. It's all the long pole in the tent is how quickly can I get my data into one place, or at least identify all the places my data is, so I can have the AI look at it. You don't need to have a ton of dedicated IT resources on this. You can actually use AI to help you understand how you should go about that and use AI as your expert on this. And there are lots of partners who are creating these tools. And so to the extent you're comfortable working with partners on tools to help you do this analysis rather than create them yourselves, that's a way to get deployment faster. So when speed and insights are your priorities and you value rapid deployments over complete customization, complete auditability, an AI first approach is a good place to at least start and explore what's out there. Now, here are the trade-offs, and I'll sort of touch on each of these, but all of these deserve a deeper conversation as you're making this decision and recognizing, as with any strategy, there are trade-offs. So this is not a clear option where one solution has everything, the other has nothing. You will have more control over your data architecture with a traditional data warehouse. You can completely customize it, decide how it's going to be. That comes at just a significantly longer implementation timeline. Related to that, the customization. Do you want to be able to have complete control? Or are you okay with something that goes faster, but you actually might not have control over? In some cases, we want control over something, but the AI actually might even have a better solution. And so you also need to think through, am I controlling it because I have sort of the right knowledge or expertise to make that decision, or just because I'm more comfortable having control? If you build something on your own and build it internally, then you have less vendor risk. You control it, you have the people to control it. And so to the extent you select a vendor to help with your AI analytics, then obviously there is a dependency there that you'll have to be comfortable with. We talked about this a few minutes ago, but the data governance is stronger with traditional warehouses. You have audit trails, you have data lineage that you can try to recreate in AI, but it is not a strength. It's an afterthought that you'd have to try and find a way to generate. And AI does have ongoing subscription fees. So this is something to be aware of. Up to this point, the cost of AI has gone down dramatically, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I don't think this is a real risk, but that is something to be aware of, that you are signing yourself up for a monthly fee into perpetuity with these tools. Now, even if you have a data warehouse, there are still ongoing maintenance costs. So this is not like a one-time cost, but it is something to be aware of, that these are subscription fees that you'll have to pay indefinitely, assuming you want to use these AI tools. Now, in terms of thinking through the data warehouse, what I have here is just an idea of what you should be thinking about as you're making this decision from a cost standpoint. And so when you think of on the left-hand side here, these implementation costs you'll pay once, assuming that, or once per implementation at least. These are things like infrastructure setup, data modeling, pipeline development, data migration, things like that that you're probably familiar with. But all of these, especially this last one here on staff training and change management, can be substantial and should be focuses of you and your team if this is the direction you want to go. Beyond that, there are operational costs you'll keep paying. So cloud storage, licensing, process management, technical staff to maintain it, updates. And so think of for both of these, either the warehouse or the AI, I'd encourage you to think of a 5-year total cost of ownership as you're making this decision to make it as apples to apples as you can. Now, the timeline here is typically longer. It's 12 to 24 months. This is obviously incredibly dependent on your organization, the size and the complexity, et cetera. But this is a ballpark. It's going to probably take a year or two before you're really up and running and have meaningful reporting capabilities. Ongoing operations are going to be a big chunk of this. Just you'll have a big upfront chunk, but making sure you have the team and the licenses in place will be significant. And the thinking here in terms of drivers are, storage we need, number of data sources, complexity, our internal capabilities. These are the types of things you should be thinking about as you're making this decision. On the AI side, these are obviously a little bit different, right? That the subscription pricing scales with usage, so that's something you'll need to think about. But there's less of a one-time upfront cost. And so the core platform costs you'll pay on a recurring basis, so cloud fees, storage, API calls, user licenses, et cetera. But we also have here on the right are things like per user licensing for a ChatGPT, for a Claude. To the extent you need help with your data integration, what does that look like? Training is a big one. This is a new skill set for many of us, learning how to use AI. And so how do you get your team who may have more expertise in traditional systems, how do they use AI to be as effective? And that's both your technical staff, but also your team who may be less reliant on technical staff to build their own reports, but are used to that. And so what is your training to help them understand what they're capable of? As we talked about earlier, you can deploy these tools quite rapidly, often with near immediate availability. But it's going to apply much more on you rather than a vendor. Like how quickly can you get up and running? Can you get your data in the right place? Can you get your teams trained? And as I mentioned, the cost scales with usage. So this isn't fixed infrastructure. This is I pay a license per seat. Or if I want to use an API, I pay per call. And the more tokens I send through, the bigger the cost is. But in many cases, this is far, far less expensive than a traditional data warehouse. And your costs here are going to depend on users, volume, integration complexity, things of that nature. But this is, as I mentioned, often a less expensive route and a route that you can understand success relatively quickly. And so another option, sort of a hybrid option we'll discuss is, hey, maybe I start with AI to see how things are going, see where my gaps are, and then I make the investments in the traditional data warehouse if needed, and I can make that warehouse much more fit for purpose on where my gaps are. In either way, I think you'll want to start embracing AI analytics. I think even for the data warehouses, this will become a bigger component. So in my view, unless you're well down the path of having a data warehouse in place, this is a great place to start to both build capabilities in AI, which is obviously becoming increasingly capable and important, while also helping you diagnose where there might be gaps that you want to make further investments in. Now, in terms beyond initial numbers, these are just some other considerations you'll want to think through. So the timing of the payment and the structure. AI costs are almost always subscription-based or some sort of monthly fee, whether that's subscription or APIs, versus a upfront capital investment. This has cash flow implications. It also has P&L implications depending on how you are recording capital investments or CapEx in general. So just something to be thinking about. There's typically far more maintenance that your team or contractors of your team need to do for data warehouses to make sure that they're working, that they're updated, and this often requires dedicated staff time. Versus the AI space, there may be needs for your team to validate new tools or get people access, but there's far less in terms of maintenance, as this is something that you're essentially outsourcing to the AI labs to provide this technology. As with anything where you're relying on a vendor, there is pricing volatility to be aware of. The pricing can change. It's possible subscription costs increase as you scale usage, so make sure you're budgeting for that. That said, as I mentioned earlier, the costs up to this point have gone down substantially, well over 90% over the last few years. There's no guarantee that continues, though. So as the models get more powerful and take more energy and take more compute, it is possible this inflects. So it's something just to be aware of as you're thinking through your budget. And as I mentioned a few years ago, think about this as total cost of ownership over a set number of years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever you prefer. But it's since there are such different structures between AI and a data warehouse, it's better to look at it over a longer period so you don't get either over or under exaggerates the cost of the upfront implementation as you're thinking through what makes sense for you. And here at the bottom is just an important message that the so-called cheaper option is obviously going to be very dependent on your organization, your timeline, your capabilities, what you prefer in sort of recording capital investments. That said, in almost every case I've seen, the AI model is both cheaper and often essential anyways. That even when we go to the warehouse, we'll also want to make sure that we're thinking through how we're doing our AI analytics. Now, I put here sort of 3 potential implementation paths, and this is not exhaustive, but this is sort of at a high level what I have seen. There is the one that you may be more familiar with, or at least historically been more used, is this sort of traditional build. We're going to spend 12, 18 months figuring out how we're going to deploy it. Again, getting user adoption, building the reports is on top of that. This is just how do we get the system in place. We spend a bunch of money up front. We have a dedicated team who both builds it or implements it, and probably a subset of that team that continues to maintain it going forward. And if your organization has really complex compliance needs, or you already have a really strong internal IT team, this could be a good option for you. The bypass approach we talked about, we go AI first. Timeline is much faster. The tools are often available almost immediately, and the time is based much more on how quickly you can get your team ready and the data in a place where you can start looking at it. There is typically very little upfront investment, unless you got like contract or something to set you up. But beyond that, from the technology standpoint, this is minimal, and you'll just start paying subscription costs. There is, if you don't want to build your own, there are a bunch of vendors who offer AI tools to do this analysis. You also can build your own if you have that capability. But typically, you don't need a very technical team to run this. You need someone asking the right business questions, but the AI takes care of a lot of the technical expertise. Or this third approach, which is one that I'm pretty fond of, sort of the typical consultant, pick the one in the middle. But the hybrid approach of let's start right away, let's use AI to see what we can. Let's start proving business value, identifying gaps, and then based on what we see, we can then consider, hey, do we actually want to invest more beyond the AI to get something a little more robust that helps with our compliance, helps with our auditability, gives us more customization. But again, that can be very fit for purpose. You can identify like, hey, AI gets us all these things. We don't need the warehouse for that. So we can actually get a smaller or more focused warehouse that's customized to do these, handful of analytics or reports that are important to us that we view as a gap in the AI technology, at least a gap today. The tricky part with this approach is the AI is always improving. So a gap today might not be a gap tomorrow. But this is, I think, a fairly safe approach of regardless of what we do, we're likely want to include some degree of AI in here. Let's start there and then identify where we have gaps rather than spend a bunch of money and then only to layer AI on top of that. Now, this is a busy slide, so hopefully you can look at this in the PowerPoint that's shared with you to spend more time with. But this is sort of a rough list of questions that I would encourage you to think through as you're making this decision. So one, what is my primary goal here? Is it to start getting strategic insights, to build these analytics, to do some exploratory analysis? If so, AI first is a great option for you. If, on the other hand, I have strict regulatory compliance requirements, I have mandated reporting formats, then a traditional build is maybe more in line with what you're looking for. Timeline pressure, how quickly do I need this? Do I need something in months? Yeah, I can do that. If, again, I maybe have more time, but I know there's this regulatory hurdle that I need to clear, then a traditional build may be a better fit for you. Budgets, do I prefer monthly or more predictable multi-year budgeting, either for compliance reasons or also just for how I want to record these costs on my P&L or your balance sheet? That is an area where you could think through a traditional might make sense. And lastly, from technical capability, you have flexibility either in your own team to learn this or relying on vendors in the near term to get you up in speed on AI. Then obviously AI is a good fit. Or if you say, hey, I already have a strong team, and again, this regulatory thing keeps coming up. If there is that, then there could be a push to have traditional infrastructure. Sort of the so what here at the bottom, and I suspect by now you sort of have understood my leaning. But in my mind, based on what I've seen with the association nonprofits I work with, based on what I've seen with the large Fortune 500s I've worked with, the default in my mind now, and especially going forward as this tech improves, is the AI first approach. Unless there's a really clear compliance or regulatory reason that mandates a more auditable or customizable system, the AI first thing just provides you a ton of flexibility that's only getting better and more powerful. Hybrid approach is available if you were either uncertain about your long-term needs or just want to dip your toe in and see where there might be gaps. But in general, less a clear regulatory justification, given the increased cost and timeline of a more traditional data warehouse. I think it's often hard to justify absent that. Now, concerns on security is a big one that I hear about with AI. There's a lot of, sure, AI is cool, but is my data leaking? Or are these big labs training their models on my data? Which is something that is an important question to ask, is something you should be comfortable with. In general, what I would tell you is, to the extent that is something you're uncomfortable with AI, is just to look into the agreement you have with your LLM, whether that's OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google, or whoever else, that these modern AI platforms, assuming you have a paid enterprise version, that this isn't a free account, they offer private cloud instances with enterprise-grade security that's suitable for government use. And so that is to say, to the extent you're comfortable using Outlook or SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, you'll have a similar level of security on these AI tools that you do on those. And so that's the litmus test that in terms of PII, it should be okay. If you are concerned about this, there are always options to use one of the open source models and deploy it internally, so it never goes back to the model to train it. I think that's often overkill for most organizations, but that is an option to explore if you say, I want to use AI, but I'm really worried about the data security. There are options to host it locally to avoid those concerns. You can also start with the proof of concept. Let's start with some non-sensitive data. Let's start demonstrating value. Maybe we say, hey, we're not going to put in this type of data for the time being. And you start building confidence and expanding to more critical data sets. Another part that we Blue Cypress use AI for is you can use AI to build out the report without giving it the whole data set. And so, for example, you can say, hey, I want this type of report. Here is a couple rows of my data, and there might be thousands or millions or more rows like this, but the AI only needs to see a few rows to understand the shape of the data, or here's the type of things that we need. And then the AI can then build a report or a tool that pulls all the data you need without actually ever seeing the data itself. And that can be a really powerful middle ground of, hey, it's going to build a report. You can almost think of it as someone building you an Excel spreadsheet. They don't need to see the full data. They just need to know, okay, here are the columns and rows and the formulas I need. And then I can give that to you, and you can then insert in the rest of your data. That can be another option that you can explore to the extent you have security concerns. You can also work with vendors who have this track record. So which vendors out there have documented public sector compliance? Do they have references they can use to make you feel comfortable? But in general, both approaches, the AI first, the traditional approach, can meet strict security requirements. Make sure you're picking the right vendors. Make sure that you understand the data encryption. Make sure you understand who has access to your data. Those are all sort of basics. But neither of them are silver bullets and have perfect security. Both of them have very substantial levels of security that, to the extent you operate with any major software or web services today, will be on par with what you're used to. But ask these questions as you're selecting vendors, selecting options. These are good things to make sure you're comfortable with. So where do we go from here? Bottom line is there are a few things I'd have you be thinking about. Number one, just realize the rules have changed. So the assumptions we all made about data warehouses were established before the current AI capabilities existed. Things have fundamentally shifted. The prerequisites have changed, and we should adapt to that. Two, make sure you're matching your reality. Cost structures, time to value, all differ dramatically between an AI first and a traditional data warehouse approach. So keep that in mind. Understand that AI will typically get you there faster and often a little bit cheaper, certainly up front, and account for that as you're deciding what you want to do first. But above all, it's this big text in the middle. Action beats perfection. We're all learning here. This is a new technology, and the best choice is going to depend on your specific situation. That said, for most, and I say most, not all, but for most public entities, barring a strict compliance mandate, the AI first approach will offer faster time to value and at a lower risk and lower cost than traditional build. But whatever you do, start generating insights somewhere, learn from the results rather than spending months and months planning. Now, that's all the material I have for you today. Thank you for your time. Again, sorry I couldn't be there in person. The parting thoughts I leave with you are stuff I've said throughout this presentation. That one, AI is here to stay. So think about how you adapt to it, how you incorporate it, whether it's an AI first solution or it's an add-on to another approach. Secondly, to the extent you do decide you need to have a traditional data warehouse or you already have one in place or one's in progress, I think that's fine. The goal here is not to say that that's the wrong choice, but it is to say, think through how you can supplement that with AI. It doesn't need to be as big, doesn't need to be as broad, or can it be focused on a specific set of use cases that require more compliance, whereas AI can do the rest. And lastly, I mentioned this on the last page, the worst choice here is paralysis. I know this is hard and tricky, and there's lots changing very fast, but you have valuable data that you should use and start learning from. And so I'd encourage you, start experimenting, start trying, do proofs of concept to get comfortable with it. And I think you'll be really happy with the results. That's that. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy the rest of the day.